All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And we, as always, hope everybody is safe and healthy and doing well. I'm sure everybody's getting a whole bored or tired of the monotony, but hopefully we can continue making progress and try to keep moving things forward. But we do appreciate your time on the call, and we hope to continue to provide everybody good, timely commentary on some of the various things that are going on in the markets and in the economy in general. And today we'll have a nice call, maybe about 20, 30 minutes or so. We actually have a special guest, and here, let me just pull up the slide. And we'll have an opportunity for our guest to speak, and I'll introduce him in just a moment. But first, I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about what transpired last week, and then we'll jump into introducing our guest and start moving forward. So S&P was down just a little bit last week, about negative 1.3% or so, following two pretty solid weeks of gains. That volatility, although still out there, seems to have diminished a little bit, and it was nice to see, even though it was down, not really major substantial swings one way or another. Congress added more stimulus money. We talked about that last week in an effort to continue to fund small businesses. We did see U.S. jobless claims come in slightly under expectations at 4.4 million. And as we discussed in the last call, we saw some pretty unique things happen in the oil industry, where last Monday it actually closed negative $37 a barrel. And although it did recover a fair amount, it obviously caused a lot of questions. And hopefully for the folks that were on our last call, we were able to talk through a little bit of that. Big news this week is earnings, and companies like Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Visa, MasterCard, Pfizer, Exxon, amongst many others, will be reporting earnings. And so far this week, we've seen a positive tick up in the market. S&P's up just a hair under 3% this week, and that brings it to right around negative 9 to negative 9.5% year to date, with the Dow looming around negative 14% year to date. So certainly quite a far jump from the late March lows, but obviously still a lot to think through and consider as we continue moving forward in the coronavirus pandemic. And for that, we wanted to have some additional people jump on the call and talk a little bit about their thoughts on the market. So we deal a lot with a company called First Trust. They're an asset management and economic research firm. They're the largest sponsor of unit investment trusts and the fifth largest ETF sponsor on the street. Most recently, the financial publication Barron's published their best fund families, and First Trust was ranked #1 in U.S. equities funds, and they have been up there for the past 2 years. But beyond asset management, Stein Wealth Advisors, we personally, Melissa and myself, we follow their economic analysis, and we have for many years, and we very much appreciate the commentary that they provide and all of the investment research and due diligence that they use as a tool for us, and we use as a tool for us in our firm. And they really let the numbers paint the picture. Oftentimes a lot of economic commentary is spun one way or another in opinion, where we really think that First Trust does a good job of providing data and providing the numbers. So we were lucky enough to have one of their economists. His name is Andrew Opdyke, and he's a member of the First Trust economic team. Bloomberg actually ranked that team as one of the top forecasters of the U.S. economy over the past several years. And in particular, Andrew is responsible for analyzing economic indicators, writing economic commentary, and producing articles on the First Trust economic blog. So we're really excited to have Andrew on our call, and hopefully give maybe a similar message, but from a different messenger, maybe not. I'm interested to hear what he has to say, and we're really excited to have him kind of paint a picture of what First Trust sees taking place within the economy. So without further ado, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us on the call today. and I'll turn the microphone over to you. And we really, again, appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Josh, for the kind introduction. I think today is a great day to be having this conversation because, we've been living through this coronavirus. We've been watching the impacts around us. We've seen it in our communities. We've seen it in our downtowns. We're starting to see it in the numbers, and the data is getting bad. But today, we got our first look at Q1 GDP. So through January and February, GDP, the output of the economy, was growing at about a 3.1% annualized rate. Then we saw this slowdown in broad swaths of the economy in March. And as a result of that slowdown in March, which really was focused heavily on the second half of the month, we saw this reduction in purchases by consumers, by businesses. We saw this slowdown in activity, and the data out this morning showed that the first quarter went from that 3.1% annualized rise through the first 2 months to the impact of March pulling it down to negative 4.8%, negative 4.8 annualized for the 3-month period. And one of the reasons I find this is so interesting and so important to discuss today is that is worse than expectations. The expectation is that it was going to come in about 3.5% negative. And look at the markets right now. We are up today about 1.7% on the Dow, about 2% on the S&P. And this is a conversation we've been having is that everybody knows the data is going to be bad. We don't know exactly how bad it is. We won't know for a little while. April is going to see the largest decline. We've been shut down for the whole month, and with the exception of a handful of states, we are still shut down, and we will be through tomorrow when we get through the end of April. But the markets, people know the data is going to be bad, and there's not a whole lot that can happen with the data as it gets released to surprise people. It's kind of shades on how bad it's going to be, but one thing to remember with all of this, if you think about it right now, we just today got our first look at Q1 GDP, and that ended a month ago. The first look we'll get at the second quarter, which will be the worst, we won't get that until July. And at the point in July when we get that data, it'll be towards the end of July, we should be living in a very different scenario than we are right now. And I think this is a story, this has kind of been the theme over recent weeks, is the economic data is showing some negative numbers, particularly the initial claims, the real-time data that we get on a weekly basis. We've seen initial claims for unemployment of about 25 million over recent weeks. When we get the data a week from Friday, May 8th, it's going to show the unemployment rate at 15, 20%. It's going to be almost double what it was back in 08, 09 at its peak. But people know it's going to be that bad. As Josh mentioned, we are seeing some of the earnings data, and the earnings data has come in a little bit stronger than expectations. But really the focus right now, and the reason the market is moving this morning, is because the eyes from an economic and a market perspective, we care more about what is happening today and the progress that's happening with the containment of the virus, the treatment of the virus, and the plans to get back open. The data this morning largely rose off of some data that came out. Gilead, who's got a drug for treatment, came out saying that the results of their testing have been positive. The markets moved higher because it looks like we're making further progress than initially expected on the cures side. We also got data out from Pfizer. Now, Pfizer was focused on a vaccine, and we had heard earlier in the week, on Monday, we got data. We got a report out from Oxford University overseas, right? Go over to England. Oxford University announced on Monday that they were moving into a mass trial for their vaccine. And they believe that this mass trial that should happen over the next month, month and a half, that if it goes kind of as expected, if the results continue to come in as they are, they believe they could have a vaccine ready to produce somewhere around 5 million units by September. Pfizer came out yesterday saying they now believe that they could have a vaccine available for emergency use, so not full-scale mass production, but working towards that, but available, approved at the end of Q3 as well. That is what the markets are focused on. It's been this focus, and I think it's been this way now for a few weeks. I believe we saw the market back on March 23rd. The economy was still largely, it was in the shutdown mode, and it was in the early stages of the shutdown mode. We knew in March that this shutdown was likely to go through at least mid, if not late April, could go into May, could go into June. We were running off the medical assumptions that it started off saying we could see 100, 200 million people in the U.S. economy ultimately contract the coronavirus. The World Health Organization at that time said that the mortality rate looked like it was between 2 and 3.5%. So that suggested we could see between 2 and 7 million Americans. Just in the U.S., we could see 2 to 7 million deaths, which are catastrophic numbers, and that was what was leading the decision-making in order to shut down the protection around us. Now, since that point, that was kind of around the depths of when the data was looking the worst. And as we've progressed on a few different sides. One of those is we progressed with the testing. Through March 4th, which is when we started to get data, we had run less than 1,000 tests nationally. And we started to ramp that up. The CDC was not ready. They didn't have the tests available. They didn't have the facilities available. They didn't have the staff necessary to work this at a larger scale. So they started that process, and we went from the 4th to the 11th. Over the span of a week, we went from under 1,000 tests to 7,600. And then over the next week, we saw this meeting take place in Washington, a press conference. The president was talking, and behind him was executives from private companies, groups like Walgreens, like CVS, that said, we're getting involved. We're going to offer our resources in order to expand this testing. And over the next week, we went from 7,600 to 76,000. Next week, we were at 470,000. We ended that month. A week after the market bottomed, we ended the month at just over 1 million tests. Now, tomorrow is the last day of April, and it looks like we are going to end this month just over 6 million tests. We'll have run 5 million tests in the month of April. And we're continuing to work to ramp that up. Our identification, and that's the name of the game with this disease, identify where the virus is and contain it. We've been ramping up the testing, and what comes along with increased testing? Well, as we increase the testing, we're going to identify more cases. Because the cases that get reported, the number that you see on the news or showing up in the headlines, that's confirmed cases, and you can't confirm a case unless you can test it. So early on, we know we were kind of under-reporting on the numbers. Every country was. Every country still is. But they were testing these numbers, and they were limited to typically severe cases because we didn't have enough tests available to move down into cases showing fewer and fewer symptoms. As we expand the testing, that's the direction that we're moving. As a result, we're seeing lower positive rates because we're testing more people who we're not sure. But it's important to get those groups because one of the things that we found out is that if you're in your teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, without pre-existing conditions, your symptoms can vary wildly. In most cases, they're very minimal symptoms, and in many cases, it's believed people are asymptomatic. They don't even know that they had it. The stuff we see on the news, if we look at New York City, right, worst case, they've been reporting their numbers, the city reports the numbers, and the health outcomes, 99.7% of the people who have passed tragically from the virus, they believe had pre-existing conditions. The outcomes for the non-pre-existing conditions, the younger ages, the health outcomes are strong. So as we made progress with the testing, we were increasing, knowing who had it. As we saw those numbers rise, we actually saw them slowing down the pace of the growth, despite the fact that we were testing wider. And then that number started to even off. It looks like we've peaked now in new cases in the U.S., and we're moving lower. We're moving lower, and at the same time, we're making the progress on the diseases, everything from the treatment side, the news out this morning, that has the markets moved, the vaccine, which is kind of one of the key pieces that people are looking at. But over the past few weeks, we've also identified the antibodies. The antibodies that your system, your body produces when you fight the disease. It's believed, this is another piece that's in testing, but they believe that having these antibodies in your system, it may create an immunity, but if nothing else, it looks like it at least reduces the likelihood you would recontract the virus. And if you do recontract it, that the duration should be shortened and the symptoms minimized. So we started to test and figure out how many people had it that we either couldn't test or we didn't know. So they ran tests. Stanford University ran one in Santa Clara, California. USC, University of Southern California, ran one with LA County. Chelsea, Massachusetts, which is kind of the epicenter in Massachusetts. New York City. And what every single group found is that the number of people testing positive for the antibodies, suggesting that they had them, is exponentially higher than initially anticipated. When LA County ran the report, they had confirmed just under 8,000 cases, 8,000. And based on their testing, they believe the real number of people who had it is somewhere between 200 and 400,000. New York City, based on their testing, it's suggesting that 1/4, 1 in 4 people in New York City has the antibodies. Every piece of this, we're learning more information every single day about the treatments, about potential cures. We're also learning more information about spread rates and mortality rates. If this data holds true from these types of locations, it looks like the mortality rate is probably going to end up being closer to 0.5%. So right now, as we look at it, as we've seen the medical data improve, as we've seen that potential outcomes, that initial estimate of 2 million to 7 million people, it started to move lower based on actions, based on data. Then the expectation is we might see 300,000 people die from the disease. Then it was 200, then it was 100, then it was 80, and now the estimates are around 60. And don't get me wrong, every single one of those deaths is tragic, and the impact it's having on individuals, on communities, on cities, states, nations, it's terrible. But we're making progress. And as we look at the markets are more focused right now on the progress that we're making on the disease, the progress we're making towards reopening, and they're paying less attention to the ugly economic data on what has already happened kind of behind us. So we're at this point now. We have 9 states that have partially reopened: Alaska, Colorado, Georgia, Minnesota, Mississippi, Montana, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee. We have 7 more where the stay-at-home order expires tomorrow. So at that point, we'll have 16 states open with 35 still in shutdown restricted, most of which are looking at doing at least partial reopens by the middle of next month. We're going to continue to watch this data. We're going to continue to have the conversations with Josh and the team as we get more information, as we see how this rolls out, as we see how people engage with the community, confirm that we're not seeing the spread as we start this reopen. And it's going to be a process. The last thing I'll leave with this one, or we'll end with on my side with this, is that keep this picture in your mind. The economy is like a muscle. It builds up over time. With a muscle, you can lift weights, you can strengthen it, you can grow it, you can make yourself stronger. The economy does the same thing. Innovation, entrepreneurship, new services, new products, new technologies, they keep moving us forward. They keep making us stronger. They keep increasing what we're able to do as a nation. But just like a muscle, when it sits dormant for a period of time, you start to see it atrophy. You start to see some deterioration. And the longer we have the shutdown, the longer that period goes on, the greater the deterioration that you see. Now, just like with a muscle, you can rebuild it back up. You can get to where you were before. You can get stronger than you were before, but the longer it stayed in non-use, the more difficult that process is. In the economy, that impact is being seen right now in these shutdowns, what it's doing with small and medium-sized businesses in particular. We've already seen some shut down, and the longer this goes on, some are benefiting, some will stay open because of the PPP, that Paycheck Protection Program. But each day, each week, we're seeing more and more companies go from a temporary shutdown to a more permanent shutdown. And the further that goes before we can kind of get people out, get these companies back on their feet, the longer the recovery period is going to take. I think right now it's looking a little more U-shaped than V. Our expectation is that the economy, it's going to start evening out in May, going to grow in June through the remainder of this year, but it's going to take us till the end of next year to get back to where we were coming into this year. But the markets, you don't invest in the economy, you invest in the markets, and the markets are tended towards the faster growing side of the economy. They move lower faster, sooner, and they tend to move higher faster and sooner. If we look back to 2009 through 2019, the last expansion we had, you can see that the markets, the earnings, the revenues of these companies moved exponentially faster than the economy as a whole. And as we're looking right now from the market standpoint, we want to be prepared for this recovery period that we're entering, because that is this stage. Keep focusing on the data related to the progress against the virus, more so than the weekly or monthly data that's coming out on the economic side, because I think to a large degree that's going to get kind of put on the back burner because, again, people say we already knew it was going to be bad. So I think there's some green shoots in the future. We're sitting here, at least in Chicago where I'm at right now. We've got April showers. You know, they say April showers bring May flowers. I think right now we're looking for those April showers, what's going on in the economy to show that new life, that new growth in May. And we're going to continue to watch that data. So why don't I stop there and pass it back to you?
Sure. Thank you, Andrew. We really appreciate it. Just a kind of a follow-up question. One thing that you had just brought up, looks like First Trust is saying towards the end of next year to kind of get back to where we were coming into the year. I guess the big question that everybody's starting to ask is the Dow from its high March 23rd bottomed out around negative 37%. Since then, Dow and S&P are up over 30%. Dow, I think, is up about 32% from its low. S&P up about 30% from its low. Is this a sucker's rally if it's going to take that long? Or do you feel that a lot of what that rally was the fear and the overselling that we may have seen from not knowing what was going to happen and the uncertainty, and now it's going to take that much longer to get back the remainder of that percentage that's left rather than maybe having a new low?
Yeah.
Or are we?
I don't think we're going to retest our lows. I can't guarantee that. I'm not, I think the market timing Hall of Fame is empty, and I'm not going to end up in there. But I do think the market, when we saw the declines, was pricing in worst case scenarios. And as each day progresses and we see that the worst case scenario outlook now is a significant improvement over where it was, that's what's providing this lift back on the markets. Now, does that mean it's going to be a consistent, steady lift higher from here? We could see volatility. We're going to see volatility as we get more information on drug trials. We had that last week. We had some pieces. This Gilead study, we had seen positive news out of Chicago. There was a negative report out of China. When the negative report came out of China, there was questions on the validity. There was questions on their testing methods, but the market reacted. The market reacted because it was giving them information on how long the shutdown, the virus may have an impact on the economy. So there may be more pieces. There likely will be more pieces like that. But we think that moving forward, the market was pricing in a 50 to 70% decline in earnings for this year based on our models. We use a model that looks at corporate profits versus treasury rates and that historical relationship to the markets over time. Now, our expectation is that this damage we're seeing in the second quarter, we're going to be working towards recovering that during the second half of this year, and we're expecting that earnings for the year will be down somewhere between 20 and 25%. And our expectation then is as we realize, and as the earnings data that is starting to come in, as the information's coming in that some of these companies are not hit as bad as the economic data is, as the economy as a whole is, that we're going to continue to see movement forward on the markets. Our target for the end of this year is to see the Dow in the 27 to 28,000 range, and the S&P on 3,200. That's a reduction from where our target's coming into this year. Because of the impacts of the virus. But ultimately what it did, our target for this year, we were looking at 3650 for the S&P. The economic fundamentals before the virus were strong. What we've essentially done is taken that target and we've shifted it back to the end of next year. That we have a strong basis for the economy. We have a strong basis for growth, and the markets will ultimately move higher with that. But the timeline's just been extended a bit. So ultimately, there will likely be some volatility. I don't expect we'll retest the lows, but we don't know for sure. There's still a lot of uncertainty out there, but I think the improvement in the data, the improvement in the outlook is going to kind of continue to lift us higher, and especially if we see the progress as the states reopen, if we do not see a significant pickup and we start seeing other states look and say, okay, we're now comfortable, so we're going to start that opening up process, and as we get more and more data on the vaccines. I think those are the two key pieces right now for continued lift in the markets.
That makes sense. Thank you. Looks like on another note, unemployment claims seem to have peaked, but still week after week coming in with millions and millions of more unemployment claims. I have to imagine that's going to be a pretty important part of this as well, is getting these folks back to work, and how high is the unemployment number going to rise, and how quickly are people going to get back to work, and do they even want to get back to work if there's more money coming into them than perhaps they were even making at their jobs? With what's going to be that relationship, and how does First Trust think that impacts the road back to economic growth?
It's a great point, and we've already seen. So I think the number, we don't know exactly. I wish I could give you a perfect number and say that the economy is going to recover starting on this date, and this is the exact number on where unemployment. It looks like right now that we're going to see the unemployment rate at 15 to 20% for the April data, and I think that most likely will be the peak, especially as we start some of these recovery efforts and we start moving people from the unemployment claims back into employment. But as you mentioned, when we increased our unemployment benefits, the payouts you get, we also increased the duration, and we've already seen some companies reporting. So the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, the way that it works is small and medium-sized businesses, 500 employees or less, could apply for a loan from the government. They looked at their 2019 costs for employment, utilities, rent. They could put in a request for 3 months of that cost. If they get the loan, what they need to do is they need to spend 70 to 75% of that on their employees to keep them employed, to pay the wages. And if they do that, then ultimately the loan is forgiven. Now, what's happened is we have some restaurants that are saying we're having trouble rehiring our employees because they are making more money on the unemployment benefit. So they have concerns about, hey, we got the PPP loan, we have every intention of hiring the staff back, but they don't want to come back because they're just making more and staying at home. That could hamper areas of the recovery if people are looking at that and saying, listen, I have a better opportunity, I have a better situation by not returning to work. But I think in general, over the next 3 to 6 months, we will see a significant movement back, people coming back into the labor force, returning to work. And if we do see a significant headwind coming from the higher unemployment benefits, we could see changes made to that. If they say the economic recovery is there, they may put new rules in place in terms of the payout. They may change some of the structure for it. But I do believe that will be a bit of a headwind to how quick the labor market recovers. It's not going to be back at 3.5%, which is where we were to start the year, the lowest level since 1969. We could see this jump to 15, 20%. And as we get towards the end of the year, we could be at 7, 8, 9%. We'll be moving lower, but we will be, I think, significantly higher than where we were coming into this year, because those companies that have already shut their doors, those are employees who don't have jobs to return to, and the new businesses need to form, or the other companies need to not just bring their employees back, but look to hire more employees in order for us to see that slack picked up. I think we'll see it happen gradually over time, but this is not a snap your fingers and everybody's back to work.
Makes sense. Well, thank you so much for your commentary. I'm just going to very quickly open it up to see if there's any other questions, and then we can wrap up. So let me just. Are there any other questions that anybody would like to ask, either myself or Andrew?
Nothing here, Josh. Thank you.
All right. Well, Andrew, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. We very much value your thoughts and certainly your partnership with Stein Wealth and First Trust. And we thank you for coming on the call, and thank you everybody for joining us. And everybody, please stay safe and healthy. And we'll have another call next week. And until then, be well. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good week.
All right. Bye-bye.